So what is strategy? Where did strategy come from? What's the history behind it? What's the evolution behind it? These are questions that most cannot answer. On the boards that I sit on, with the CEOs that I coach, they cannot answer that question. I hear responses back such as tasks or possibly goals, but it's a lot more. And it forced me years ago to want to understand more about the background of history and where it came from. So it's taken me on this unique path. And Carl, I think one of the first things when we started to speak about this conference, I thought to myself it would be interesting to take this as an excerpt from my speaking and solely talk about that potentially as an intro for this particular conference, which I think is going to be, I think you'll find it interesting. So we'll start with what is today the current definition of strategy. This is the current accepted definition of strategy. And it's quite neat. It's a careful plan or method, usually over a period of time, to achieve a specific goal. I can tell you that I don't subscribe to this. I don't agree it's a careful plan always. I don't think it's over an implied longer period of time. And when's the last time you were able to apply a strategy to one single goal? Now, if it said goals with an S, I would be a little more excited about that, but I'm not. So what we're going to do is let me walk you through some of the history and the background of where strategy came from. And I want to come back to this and redefine what I view as strategy today, because it has changed, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Even the speed of the definition of strategy will change even faster. And I know we have some great speakers that will be talking about AI, machine learning, and big data. I'll touch on a few of those areas high level, but that will even speed up further what our understanding and our definition of strategy will be in the future. So let's start out with the history. I'll touch on a few quick points here, and there's a reason that I wanted to show a quick timeline. So we're all familiar with the story of the Trojan horse where the Greek forces entered Troy. Many are familiar with Machiavelli's book, The Prince, which talks about different, I'll say, political science or recipes for government officials. I'll touch on that a little bit further in a moment. It's a great example of strategy. And we go all the way to current day, this Re-Engineering the Corporation, which, if you get a chance, is a great book to read. It basically was the reinvention of corporate structure. It's one of my most favorite books that I've read. There's a reason that I picked 3 of these out of the hundreds and thousands of examples that we can look at across the period of our strategy throughout history. And the reason for that is that there is truly only 3 professions where strategy has been used and where it's been honed. There's only been 3. And those 3 are the following. Going back 2,500 years to current day, strategy has only been applied to war, politics, and business. That is it. So in the early days of Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago at 500 BC, we're going to talk about him in a moment, warmongering was great. But what was amazing about this is that these strategies were not just about winning wars, they were about how do you avoid wars and still win those wars. Another great book to read. Politicians, still to this day, used for gaining power and holding on to power. And business leaders, of course, everything we're talking about today. Well, I shouldn't say monopolies. I should say in the past it's been used for monopolies and building power. Today I think we are a little more ethical in our approach with strategies. So across these 2,500 years, there's really only 6 phases of evolution of strategy. And I mentioned a moment ago, going back to 500 BC, war strategies and conflict deterrence, all the way through to 1900, politics and exclusivity. It's amazing to think about the bulk of the 2,500 years of strategy is truly only focused in these 2 phases. Most of the evolution of strategy has been seen from 1900 until today. And the speed of this is increasing. Now, one of the last things to point out on this particular evolution is that we don't currently have a name for the phase of strategy as of right now. I've been adopting this term called amorphic strategy because I believe the speed of the change of strategy and the need of the speed of change of strategy, it's more of this liquid type of flowing thing that you're trying to hold up. It's liquid, it's moving, it's amorphic. I don't know if that name will stick, but until there's a more accepted name globally, that's the name that I use in my speaking. So let me walk you through some of the different areas of this evolution and these different phases. There's some great examples to get an understanding, which will lead us back to our definition of the understanding of where we're going now with some of the areas I mentioned with AI and machine learning. So, Sun Tzu I mentioned. Winning the battle without fighting is the best way to win. Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, which is still referenced today. In fact, many of the military strategies of countries, they still reference back to this book today. It was written in 500 BC. It's absolutely amazing to think about this. This goes back to war strategies and conflict deterrence, so 500 BC in this time frame. Politics and exclusivity. Machiavelli. We both think of him both positively and negatively over the years, right? His book, The Prince, still referenced to this day, one of the core readings for political science classes. It's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Interesting way to look at it. John D. Rockefeller, when we get into exclusivity phase, we think of monopolies. We think of no competition, controlling everything. His strategy was to control everything so there was no competition. If you have a monopoly, it's pretty easy to do that. Now, he was pretty ruthless in his approach with his strategies, and it was up until, I think it was 1904, when one of the first instances of journalism, or I should say investigative journalism, through Ida Tarbell wrote an expose, and it was called The History of Standard Oil. That one expose was the break in the armor for John D. Rockefeller. It started basically all of the governmental actions to break up monopolies, that one thing. So it's again proof that one person can make a difference. Industrial proficiency stage. Peter Drucker, who you all know is the father of modern management, he classified the strategy of the 1900 to 1968 period as simply a competition on price. And this worked well in some of the earlier years. If you made a product and it was the same as everybody else's and you sold it for cheaper, you would win that market. The problem with this strategy, and you'll see that many of the strategy, the ends of the phases, ended with a problem, which led us into the next phase of strategy. So the problem with competition on price is that you're continually driving yourself to the bottom of the barrel. Even if you have the best product in the world, if you don't sell it for the cheapest, it's unlikely that you're going to corner that market or be known as the leader in that market. So this particular period ended in 1968 when a new model was introduced. And Michael Porter writes about this in his book, What is Strategy? Another one of my favorite books. I think this gentleman is brilliant. You know, every once in a while you'll see somebody that's able just to look into something that seems so obvious and write a description and an example and where that's going and just have this very clear and lucid approach to it. Michael Porter is definitely one of those people. He comes out and starts to talk about the strategy heydays, the 1969 through the 1990 period. And in this time frame, he says, well, yes, it's about how much something costs, and that's really coming back to do what everybody else is doing, but spend less money doing it. So he flip-flopped this and said, okay, we're going to look at both the sale price as well as the cost to make this product, this service, or whatever our output is. But he said also, let's do something that no one else can do. Let's make something a little bit different. It may be the same base product, it may be the same base service, but we want to do something slightly different that gives us the edge. And this was a great strategy. But the problem was that we had a big change coming, and that was technology. And technology was going to be the end of this particular phase of the strategy heydays. Now, strategic proliferation phase, the 1990s to 2010 time period. And I've come to learn that whenever I hear that word proliferation, I don't always think positively anymore. We think of things like nuclear proliferation and other things that don't have such a positive connotation to them. And with the internet, everybody who had a say or had an idea was creating their own strategies, and they were packaging them, and they were selling them. The internet really was the form of proliferation for strategy in the 1990s, even to this day. And it looked at three areas. It said, we want to do something new. We don't want to stick with this, let's go back to what other folks have done or other companies have done. We want to do something new. But we want to build on what's already been done so we're not reinventing the wheel 100%. And we have the ability now, through the internet and the speed of information, to look at these emerging opportunities. These could be things that were negative in markets, or economies, they could be positive, but we want to be at the forefront of this. So the internet allowed for this look at what's happening to say, how are we going to adjust our strategy for a faster speed to market on these areas? But there was a problem also with the proliferation phase. And this phase was basically known for the fact of the volume of different strategies. And this is just probably the background of this page is just a look at, I think I scrolled down for 10 minutes on all of the different titles of the strategies that came out and the names behind them in the 1990s to today. And there are thousands of them, thousands of them. But as these strategies piled up, so did the complexity. And many companies entered this paralysis state. Last I looked at the numbers from 1990 to the end of the 2010s period for this phase, we were in the trillions of dollars of wasted money that could be directly correlated back to mismatched strategies that were implemented in companies. These are amazing numbers, amazing. Some of my consulting work is actually coming in to look at these projects that have failed. Some of these projects have been running for 15 years. And when I look at them, I realize that they have the wrong base tool or base concept that they're using for their strategy. But how do you tell a company that for 15 years and the $1.5 billion they've been spending on this is probably not going to be a fit because it's not going to allow them to be nimble at the point AI and machine learning totally kicks in? But I have to tell them that. That's my job. They don't like it. Some other interesting things to point out in this proliferation phase, and Michael Rayner, another great book, The Strategy Paradox. I had to read this book twice to make sure I fully understood it. But it's very, very interesting. If we look at the things that make strategists or implementers successful, we realize it's the same description that actually makes them failures. So if we look at a compelling vision, a bold leadership, and taking decisive action, these sound like positive things. But the realization here, the data shows that just as many failures were because of those same three reasons. So the strategy up front can be somewhat flawed even if you're going into it with the most positive of intentions. This to me worried me. It's the reason I read this book twice, and I said to myself, I feel like I have a compelling vision. I feel like I'm a bold leader, and I feel like I'm very clear with decisive action and decisive decision making. But if you're telling me that history, 50% of the time that could make me fail, it makes me a little bit nervous. So this is the strategy paradox that Michael Rayner talks about. It's a collision between commitment and uncertainty. How do you make the commitment to your organization when you know there's uncertainty? Now, in the past, it used to be that you could kind of manage the risk of this because you had time to course correct. You had the time to say that over a period of so many quarters, we could see if something was getting off track and we had enough time to jump in there and straighten that out. Well, those time limits are getting shorter now. And I can tell you the companies that are setting their 2, 3, and 5-year strategies, I think it's great in practice, but if they're driving to those 2-year look-ahead strategies right now and not reevaluating those quarterly, they're going to have some problems. This has to do with the speed, and it's this collision between the commitment and the uncertainty. The scariest leaders, to me, are the ones that don't realize that there should be uncertainty. Again, they have the bold vision. They're committed. They have all of these positive things, but they're not sure what they don't know. And that, to me, is where certain tools, and it's one of the reasons, Carl, that we've spoken so often, is that some of the tools allow for that transparency to understand what you don't know. Super important to know. So what is next in all of this? How do we go from this history where we look at almost every phase had a problem, right? And I'm a pretty positive person, I think, but every time I do this speaking on the strategy side, I feel negative because I start out with a happiness of, new strategy, is something new starting, and then it ends on something that's negative. But we all realize that when something ends, something good starts following that, we hope. And I think that is the case with the history of strategy. So if we look at right now, again, what I'm calling a morphic strategy, this word just keeps coming back to me, and it's this word of simultaneity. Simultaneity is the number of things happening at the same time that are all affecting each other. This is somewhat of a scary word to me. I already feel like I'm maxed out in trying to get all the data I need to make decisions, and you're telling me there's going to be more, and there's going to be computers and AI and machine learning that's going to feed me even more information, and that thing's going to be smarter than me to make those decisions. But how do I take all that in? And I don't have an answer to that question as of yet. But I do want you to know the following. If I look at strategy from a board viewpoint, and by the way, I view strategy not specifically being owned only by the CEO of an organization. I actually truly believe that when you hear the word board of directors, you should not only think of the word governance. To me, the first word you should think of is strategy, and then the follow-up word is governance. And I say that because how do you know what you're going to govern if you don't understand the strategy? So data analytics, to me, and big data, the board can use that, and any organization can use that as their data feed and their input. There's been technology advancements, there's disruption, market trending. But I keep coming back to this machine learning and artificial intelligence, and I wanted to share just something very quickly from my book for a moment here, and it's examples of how machine learning and artificial intelligence have truly permeated our environments without many of us even knowing. And yes, I wear reading glasses now, and I don't like them. First example of machine learning and AI in the board space. World's largest hedge fund has a team of engineers working on a project to automate decision-making to save time and eliminate human emotional volatility. I like that, human emotional volatility. This software and AI will automate the day-to-day management of the firm, including hiring, firing, and other strategic decision-making. So think about this. We're already talking about the ability of software to take over roles that we would normally do. Now, we could argue, is that good or bad, right? Maybe the human emotion sometimes is good. I like to be emotional sometimes. I like to have a personal connection with people that I work with. I want to know what they're happy about, what they're struggling with. It makes us human. But sometimes, how do we truly get just down to the basics of understanding, is there productivity or not? Are we maximizing our outputs? Is this person working in my organization? And that leads me to one other quick quote I'll read for you from my book. On the topic of artificial intelligence, a Hong Kong VC venture capital fund named Deep Knowledge Ventures appointed an algorithm to its board in 2014. This algorithm is listed and seated board member in this company and gets a vote on all investment opportunities. So think about this. In that room, they actually hold a board seat. It's an empty seat. All the materials that the board members have, they put it there as a reminder that in the background, there's an algorithm that they rely on to make hiring and firing, and mainly right now, investment decisioning. And there's no human emotions in this, or what they said, that human emotional volatility, right? Does it make sense or does it not? I think our biggest ethical question of the time is going to be, how much do we listen to the AI side to this, and how much do we rely on our emotions? That, to me, is going to be the balance of decision-making for our time. So two quick examples of how strategy will be changed with these inputs. Strategy both is the input side of where you're getting your data from, and it's the output side of how you're utilizing those actions. What are your actions from that data that you're getting? So keep in mind, this term of simultaneity, it's something that is always in the back of my mind, especially in board meetings, where I say to myself, do we have everything we need to make a decision? Is our strategy sound in that we've looked at other things that could affect us, and have we even thought outside the box in terms of something we have not thought of? Many of the boards that I design, I like to look at one person who is always that naysayer. I don't want everybody saying yes to everything that's proposed. I want them to come back and almost be viewed as crazy because they're thinking about something that is very different. It leads the boards down a totally different route in terms of what their outcome of their decision is. Simultaneity. Now, one other thing to mention before we come back to redefining our definition of strategy. I struggled for years, many years ago, on saying, when someone said to me, let's go to the strategy meeting or the strategic planning meeting, and I said to myself, okay, sounds great, sounds important. If you put the word strategy and planning in front of the word meeting, it sounds better. It sounds more important. Your attendance is actually better. But what does it actually mean? So I started to say to myself, and I think in threes. Threes are the easiest way for someone to remember. That could be actually a strategy for you, is to think of the fact that if you remember in threes. So I said, if I had to draw a visual diagram of what strategy is and where it sits, what does that look like? So I started to think about objective and action. And I broke this down to the fact that I've been in strategy planning meetings before where the goals were not set. So what were we talking about? We were talking about tasks. It was only tasks. We never knew if those tasks were aligned to the overall goals of the organization until we set our goals. But most companies, they talk about their strategy first before they even have their goals set. So trust me in this when I tell you, and I know many of you are experts in the strategy space, but if you need an easy way to describe strategy to people in your organizations or others that you're working with, understand that goals sit on one side, tasks are on another, and strategy is that two-way arrow in between. It's the how, and we're going to talk about that in our next piece here. So, how do we bridge our objective and our actions? If we look at strategy and only ask the word how, it drives a discussion to the right level when you're talking about strategy. So think about this. You're in a meeting, and it's called a strategic planning meeting. If you're talking about goals in that meeting by themselves, that is not a strategic planning meeting. Goals to me should be set first, then you're talking about how you're going to achieve them. The how of strategy could be the AI and the machine learning. It could be the boots on the ground of people actually doing the work manually. It could be a combination of the two. Ask the question how when you hear the word strategy. And the last way to look at this, if we do another overlay on goals, strategy, and tasks, is to say, if you're in the governance realm, and this is something that I police myself on in the board space continually. I say, am I asking the right questions? Am I focusing in the right areas? So I say, if it's goals, I want to help to set, and then I want to ensure their relevance. And that's not just a one-time task. Once they're set, we are constantly evaluating, do those goals still make sense for the organization? I like to do that on a quarterly basis. Then we talk about strategy to say, how are we going to reach those goals? Can we validate the approach? Is there another company out there right now that has the same goals as us because they're a competitor, but they have a different how? They have a different strategy of how they're going to get there. They found a new software. They've developed a new tool. The tasks are a byproduct of where you're focusing the goals and the strategy. Interesting way to look at this. I find it quite helpful for me. So let's go full circle for a moment and just come back to the definition. Strategy, to me, the definition used to be these tangible things, a plan you could hold in your hand, a period of time that you could define. And I think those are still pieces of it. But that old definition does not tell the full story anymore. And there's words that stand out to me in what I view as the new definition of strategy, which are guiding principles of a desired pattern of integrated decision-making. It's this integrated decision-making that is the most important part of this whole definition. How are you getting the data and the input, the people, the things that you need to make a proper decision? I believe today that one single person can no longer lead a company. And I'm going to clarify what I mean by that. It used to be that the board relied on the CEO to do everything, create the strategy, deliver that, in charge of operations, lead the whole company, and the board was simply there to govern. Govern was basically, this is going right, this is not going right, you need to fix this. I have a whole different thought process on this right now, as I mentioned earlier. To me, the board should be intimately involved in the strategy creation and the strategy oversight, which is the governance component for those boards. So, in order to do that, I want boards from an architecture standpoint that have expertise in both the strategic and the governance area, not just the expertise on that particular industry or that vertical or that technology or whatever specific drill down area. It's when these groups get together and they have that common denominator of the skill sets of governance and strategy, that's when you get this pattern of integrated decision making. It's the most important part to think about when you think of strategy. It's the how, and it's how you're going to integrate in this integrated decision making component. And remember, you're always asking the question, is what I'm saying in support of the goals or looking for areas that are going to hinder us reaching our goals? That is strategy. So, a few things in closing. Remember to approach your strategic planning in a disciplined manner. It's not just getting together in a room. It's not just putting down a set of tasks. It's thinking to yourself, I want to set my goals first, and then I want to understand what my strategy is. How am I going to reach this? And my limitations on this, or my constraints, are always budget, scope, and time. So the how, and then budget, scope, and time. How, budget, scope, and time. Leverage tools that can help you with this. I don't think it's possible just for one person, again, to sit down and create a strategy that's viable for a company. Now, when you bring a group of people together, it's even harder to get them scheduled, and it's even harder to get information and transparency between them. So how do you do that? You do that through specific tools, like we talked about today. And the other big piece in closing on this is the change component on this. I will tell you, in the executive consulting and the executive coaching that I do right now, this is the biggest barrier. There is this pushback on change. Well, we've always done it this way, and it's always worked. What's always worked is almost guaranteed to not work in the upcoming years. It is not possible anymore. I personally have learned to like change when I hear the word. I don't know how I got to that point. I think I just kept trying to tell myself that it's good to change. And it can be exciting. But it involves constant learning. You're constantly educating yourself. You're constantly reading new things. You're looking into new outlets. So don't be scared of this change. It's those that do not change that you're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, that their industries will be totally changed, and they'll have nowhere to go. They'll have nowhere to apply any of the skill sets that they've honed over the years. And it only takes a little bit of effort to actually take what you know and transform it and change it into something new that's supportive of a new industry or a change in an industry. I welcome you to read my book, although it's focused in the board space. It's very much around strategy. I dedicated a whole chapter. Chapter 5 is on strategy. Many of the things we talked about today with some more detail. I also, if you're interested, you can follow my strategies at pfisterstrategy.com. I have a newsletter that comes out, and I think everything that I write about has some component of strategy or governance to it. I thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So we want to give an opportunity here. We're going to have a little bit of a break here coming up, but any questions for Mark on his book in terms of presentation and history? Actually, we'll lead off with a question, and then
Sure.
We'll go from that. So Sun Tzu, that's The Art of War. It's one of my favorite books. What of that part you think is still present and living today?
So the piece that most people talk about with Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, is the deterrence factor of this. So if we look at, and I hate to use a war example, but it is a book about war. If we look at both the U.S. and the Soviets' nuclear policy, it was built off of deterrence. So it was whoever has the most nuclear weapons is a deterrence, because we know that there's no great outcome that can come from that. So the buildup of weapons, unfortunately, was used as the deterrence. So to avoid war, they actually built out more war machines, and that was a prime example of that. Not the best example, but the happiest one, but it's the one that's been used.
Yeah. Any questions from the? Yeah.
Mark, there are 3 different places. There's the big companies, which apparently, a lot of where you're doing work, they've got boards of directors and they're in charge of strategy. Over at the other end, we have startups who have bold visions and nobody working with them. And then in the middle, we've got small and medium businesses of $10 to $200 million that are family owned, and strategy is not a word that I'm finding that they understand. Any insights for
Sure.
the startups and
Sure.
the small and medium businesses?
So I will tell you that in my consulting work, I like to keep a portfolio of companies that span from 2-person startups right now up to Fortune 50. And I find that by working with the 2-person startups, it makes me a better consultant for the Fortune 50. And by working with the Fortune 50, it makes me a better consultant to the startup. I will tell you that I don't view big differences when I talk about strategy or governance in those particular areas. I don't treat it differently. In some cases, I have more deprogramming to do in the larger companies than I have programming to do in the smaller companies. So I find it in some cases more fulfilling and a little bit easier to do. But your question is specific to the application of strategy or introducing strategy into those companies' DNA?
Well, small companies don't have the time to spend 3 days or 3 weeks developing strategy. It's very much focused on one person deciding what they should do.
Correct. And I agree to that to a certain degree. And I will say this. Based on those 3 pictures, that picture I drew earlier of goals, tasks, and strategy sitting in between, most companies, even at the earliest stage of thought, Tom, where's Tom? When he mentioned earlier about when they were starting that company, I can tell you that those areas can be pieced into that. They decided on what their goals were going to be first. What do they want a solution? What was their outcome they were looking for? And then they talked about the how. How are they going to get there? They chose a software, and they chose to develop that software. And from that spilled out the tasks that had to get done. So again, I don't think there's a size limit to this by any means, or whether it's small or large. I think it's the same thought process in the background. Somebody could sit down and actually right now develop what they view as their strategy at a very high level. I like to think that you have the other folks around you as a sounding board, whether it be a formal board of advisors, a board of directors, consultants such as you and I in that space, and they can bounce those ideas off. But I do not by any means view the thought process or the operationalizing of that as any different. I just think it's on a different scale. Yes?
Mark, there's perception within some companies that the governance is leasing function.
Yes.
Proposing to start off chapter 6 comment, speed of decision making is the essence of good governance.
Mm-hmm.
You coach your clients from thinking about governance.
So governance has taken on a negative connotation. And I even, it's funny, there's a bunch of words that are associated with boards that have taken on negative connotations. Governance is one, committees is another, and I write a little bit about this in the book. We think of committees and we think of, the design of a requested horse goes in, but a camel comes out, because all these people had these different ideas and something that looks funny and, that comes out the other end. But governance to me, I will say, and that's why I said earlier that it's not the first word that comes to mind when I think of a modern day board of directors or a modern day governance, the governance realm. I'm thinking when you hear the word governance, the first thing that should pop into your mind is the strategy component of that. So to answer your question, I like to think of the strategy side first. The governance to me, another great word I think that I use interchangeably is transparency. Right? Governance to me is typically, it's a group pointing downward towards another that something is wrong or you should be doing it differently. Transparency to me changes that conversation. It says, how do you give me that look behind the kimono? How do you, behind the curtain to see what's actually happening there so I can actually weigh in on this and help you along that process. So I do think there's some negativity around that. You'll see a lot of my speaking, I like to transform that word of governance into transparency, and I think that starts to drive the right behaviors. Yes?
How do you think that social media and the proliferation of internet and people voicing their concerns has affected that and morphed in shape of strategy?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. It's part of the reason I never had a Facebook account. But everybody has a voice today. And I'll give you a quick example, and again, I go back to the book because it's fresh in my mind. The Super Bowl last year, following the Super Bowl, there was that show, This Is Us, that came on. I think I've only seen one of the episodes, and it was the one I'm going to talk about right now. So, Super Bowl's over, you get 20, 30, 40 million people that go and watch This Is Us. In the This Is Us episode that I went back to watch, there's a scene there where the crock pot that's on the kitchen counter burns the house down and one of the main characters dies. First thing that crosses my mind, I'm like, that is a PR disaster for whatever company owns crock pot, which turned out to be Newell Brands. First thing that crossed my mind, I'm like, oh my God. If I was on that board, I would like shut the TV off and I would make the phone call immediately. As it turned out, it's exactly what happened. The social media side immediately went mad, talking about, throw your crock pot out. There were videos of people taking sledgehammers to crock pots in their driveways, and it was crazy, absolutely crazy. So the ability of a company to understand that risk, and Newell Brands, by the way, handled this unbelievably. It's one of the best responses in a crisis mode that was thrown on them. They were probably all happy, the Super Bowl was over, they were going to watch the show, and all of a sudden they're thrown in the spotlight for, grandma's crock pot burning the house down and killing your favorite character. But they were ready for this. They actually had a risk plan or a response plan for this, a crisis plan. And within a matter of an hour or two, they had already started the drip feed out there about, grandma's going to be upset if you get rid of your crock pot that's been handed down. And, there's never been one case in history where this happened. They're still at it today, by the way. They've seen the success of that social media aspect and they've turned it. But you're absolutely right. It is a fear. In boardrooms, it's talked about all the time. Absolutely. I hope that was a good example for you, though. Very good. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Carl and Tom, thank you for the opportunity as well. Appreciate it.